Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adult Ed. My name is Allison, and I'm the campus minister, college-age young adult minister for State College Presbyterian Church. And this is my friend, Austin. We met in seminary. She has a Master's of Divinity. She's a poet, a My Little Pony enthusiast, and a really great friend. And I'm so glad to be with her as we jump into this text. So hi, Austin, welcome.
Hi, Allison. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited. I wish I got to meet everyone in your church, but this will do for now, huh?
Yeah, they're pretty great.
I've heard great things.
Good. So we're going to, for this week and next week, look at a few unnamed women in the Bible. And we're hoping to explore the lives, motivations, humanity, I guess, of these characters that are not given names in our text. We'll ask how their lack of names on the page affect how we read their stories and hopefully give them a little bit of loving attention that they deserve. So, as we focus on women, it is a really important perspective, I think, because these women that we're going to be looking at are normally background characters or considered background characters, and their stories can often be less familiar to us. And so by highlighting them, we get different perspectives on our Holy Scripture, and also, I think, different perspectives on God. And I think that's just helpful for our spiritual journeys. Our posture as we approach this story is that of appreciation for Scripture, but we're also going to come in with some critical questions, and we want to be careful in our reading not to put our contemporary ideals onto these women that we're highlighting, but we want to understand ways that they are empowered through their actions or ways that they reveal new truths to us about God, the story, maybe even ourselves. So that's kind of the goal for what we're hoping will come out of this time. Austin, is there anything else you want to add about like a posture that we're taking or?
Yeah. While you were talking about how we respect Scripture, I was just thinking about so often our respect for Scripture gets conflated with a specific reading of who the good guys are. And I think that can feel threatening sometimes if you've always read a story as like, this person is the good guy. And to be critical of that reading or that character might seem a little dangerous if that's the way you've been reading it your whole life. And so we don't want to challenge that too much. We love the Bible. That's why we spent so much time in seminary hanging out and reading it. But I think there's so many of the characters are often used to prop up those readings of who the good guys are. And so looking at those other characters as people in their own right and from their own perspective, it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that's okay. And that's good. And we might say some challenging things, but it makes us uncomfortable too. And sometimes we like being uncomfortable. It's good for us.
Yeah. I often think about it as like, sometimes you flip the Bible upside down, but like when you're done, you can flip it right side up again. Like it doesn't have to be
it's a good phrase.
Like we're absolutely changing the narrative. We're just asking questions so that we can look at it in different ways, and maybe God will speak to us through that, and maybe we'll walk away and say, that was really weird, and let's not do that again.
An exercise in imagination.
Absolutely. I was going to say, another thing is that we pick these unnamed women who are considered background characters, which means there's not a lot of detail about them in the text. So we are both going to employ our tool of sacred imagination, and we hope that you'll do the same with us, because we're going to be wondering a lot and speculating some, but doing it in a way that we think is going to be authentic to ourselves and to who we understand God to be. So before we jump into the actual reading of the text, we're going to be in Genesis 19 this week. And I just want to acknowledge that some of the events in this text are difficult ones. This isn't a text that's normally preached from the pulpit. And some of the events can be shocking to us. They imply violence against women or incestuous relationships. And so I just want to prepare you, and as we prepare ourselves too, just to be open about how God works through these difficult texts, to not judge the text too quickly, but also if you need space away from those topics right now, like maybe this isn't isn't the adult ed session for you. However, we're not going to be focusing on those specific behaviors really, but they are a part of the story. So I wanted to acknowledge that before we get in. So let's talk about the context of Genesis 19. Austin, will you tell us what we need to know about what we need to know?
I hope so.
Good.
I'll try. Yeah, so I started reading at Genesis 12 to get some context for this story. That's where we first meet Abraham after Noah and all that good stuff in the beginning. And so if you'd like to get the context for yourself, I found that there were parts in those chapters that I hadn't noticed before or ever heard. I was like, is this the same Genesis? So that was exciting for me, but it was, I can't do math, seven or eight chapters that I was reading through. So turns out Abraham's family is pretty incestuous. That was something that I, knew, but in my mind, I'm always just like, well, that's how they did it back then. But I think we can be a little bit more curious about that and maybe see some family systems in play that are going to be carried through our story in ways that we can be curious about. So Abraham and Lot and Sarah are called away from Abraham's family in verse 12. And actually, this was preached on at my church a week ago, so that was interesting for me to hear this sentence, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to land that I will show you. I've always read that as like, this is a challenging thing, like I'm going from everything I love, but it was turned a little bit last week, and it was maybe that was the specific call, like this family is not a healthy place for you. I'm calling you out of that. I'm calling you to choose something new. Also in chapter 20, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, we find out that Sarah is actually Abraham's sister. So, there are several times when Abraham is going into Egypt, going into a different kingdom with Abimelech and lying and saying, Sarah's my sister, so that he doesn't get killed because Sarah's beautiful and the kings want to take her. So it says he lies and says he's his sister, but that's actually true. It's just not the whole truth. So that was something new I learned last week. Anyway, so Lot and Abraham and Sarah are off. We don't know what happened to Lot's mother, but Lot's father has died. She was also part of that incestuous family. And they're going out. They went to Egypt during a famine. That's when Pharaoh was lusting after Sarah, and Abraham was like, take her instead of killing me. She's my sister, it's fine. And then Pharaoh finds out that that's not something God is into. And so Pharaoh sends Abraham away with a bunch of money and riches. And that's when the character Hagar becomes part of Abraham's household as well. You might remember her. Abraham and Lot are now wealthy and settling in the same spot, but they realize they're so wealthy that they can't stay all in one spot. They have too many servants, too many livestock, so they decide they're gonna split up and take their own land. And so Lot settles in this valley, the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham is up on a hillside where he looks over the valley. And there's this great war, 5 kings against 4 kings of different cities, and it's fought in this big valley with the sulfur bitumen pits that swallow up the kings. It feels like the end of a Lord of the Rings movie with this epic battle going on. And at the end of this is the part that I never knew before and was fascinated by, that Lot and his family get taken into captivity after this war happens, and then Abraham gets all of his men, a couple hundred, together to go on this rescue mission to bring Lot and his family and his household back home. And then the kings around Abraham are so excited about this. They try to give him a bunch of money in payment. He says, no, I won't take anything from you. I don't want you to say you were responsible for my wealth. In all of that, we don't know where Lot's wife is. We don't know if she's been traveling with them since the beginning, if she was picked up in Egypt, if she was one of the people who lived in the valley, if she went into captivity with Lot or not. We don't hear about her until the end of chapter 19, which we're going to be looking at today. I think.
Yeah. So basically a lot happens.
A lot happens.
There's a lot of potential for trauma, and there's a lot of chaos, and
that was Lot's
separation of family, and all of that stuff is kind of the scene that is set for.
Yes. And then right before, I missed chapter 18. We're going to do a little bit more. So right before chapter 19 happens, there are 3 men that come and visit Abraham, and it's pretty ambiguous in the numbers and who they are, but it's 3 men, and Abraham receives them as my Lord. And I try to resist putting all of my Trinitarian ideas of God onto that, and like my New Testament theology onto, like, of course, one of them's Jesus, holding back difficultly. But these 3 men come visit Abraham, and Abraham cooks for them, and they're getting ready to go down into the valley, the Sodom and Gomorrah valley, to see what's going on down there, because there have been cries that have come up to God, and God wants to go find out what these outcries have been about. And Abraham argues with God and with his Lord. We don't know exactly what this means there, and these numbers shift too, from like 3 to 1 to 2. Sometimes it says they, and then it's he was talking, and I just think that number fluctuation is fascinating there. But Abraham argues and says, what if there are 50 righteous in the city, God? Will you save the city on behalf of 50 righteous? And God says, yes, I will do that. That sounds good. But what if there's only 45? Will you still save the city? Will you destroy the city for the lack of 5 righteous people? And Abraham talks God down to say, if there's 10 righteous people in the city, I will not destroy it. Enter chapter 19.
Enter chapter 19. And perhaps the real concern for Abraham is his family is there too. So that's where we jump in. Mm. So
who he clearly cares about after going to war for him.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. Austin's going to read for us verses 1 through 26 of chapter 19. And I don't know if we've explicitly said yet, but the characters that we are going to be focusing on are Lot's daughters and Lot's wife. So as we read, we hope that you'll have your Bible with you as well. But if not, you can just listen to Austin as she reads, and we'll be paying attention to those characters. So
if you have any questions, just raise your hand.
Okay.
Genesis 19. The 2 angels, why are there 2? We don't know. I don't know. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, and then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside and entered his house, and he made them a feast, and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-laws, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, Get up out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, they said, "Flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh, no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills for fear the disaster will overtake me and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Very well, I grant you this favor too, and will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So let's talk about Lot's wife. This scene is so beautifully mysterious to me. What? I think traditionally, let's start there maybe. Traditionally, the way I've heard Lot's wife described is she's like the epitome of disobedience, right? Like she turned and looked back, and so she wasn't looking forward to God, or she wasn't having trust or hope. And I think even her unnamedness kind of affects that, in that we can just kind of like scapegoat all the like bad things onto her.
It was kind of a cipher.
Yeah. And so, and I think traditionally I've thought like Lot, in comparison to her, is like following God's direction. And I think that that's not what the text tells us. So she's mentioned here, this iconic verse, "But Lot's wife behind him looked back and she became a pillar of salt." And other than that, she's just mentioned by the angels of like, grab your wife, like, let's go. And I originally, when I brought this passage up, as we were planning what text to use, I asked the question, I wonder, like, what made her to look back? And so Austin and I have been thinking about that a little bit. I don't know, Austin, what are you reflecting on today as we think about her looking back?
Yeah, I feel like I come to this text in different moods, and my mood greatly affects what I see in it. And that might be because she's such a mysterious character that I'm also just filling her up with things that I'm feeling. I hope I don't do that too much, or it's, helpful to name that we're doing that and then be able to interact with the text and bring the text into our lives. What am I thinking about her today? Last time we talked, I was feeling very philosophical about what she symbolized. And today, I just want to know more about her. I want to know where she's from. Is she from Abraham and Lot's family originally? Has she been with them the whole time? Was she a gift from Egypt when they were rich there? Was she from this city originally and she's watching her home burn? I feel like I was trying to pray over this passage yesterday, and I was trying to figure out who she was in my mind, and I have this picture of a face that just refuses to become anything more than that. And so I'm ready to wonder about what those different realities might mean for her and for this story. But I'm also feeling frustrated that we don't get to know.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I often feel frustrated that we don't have more information. I have a lot of questions about her too. I think that, wondering why she looked back. Is it like what are the memories? What are the images that are coming to her mind? Is it, seeing her girls as young kids, like this was the place perhaps they were learn to walk, or like this was the first home that she felt like she could settle into, or there's all of these things. And I think that the shift that I'm thinking about from the like traditional kind of like she's this pillar of disobedience to this like, I don't know, very human. I'm just thinking a lot about how every time I've had to go through a transition, or even now, like having the fortitude to like hope for the future and to trust and to move again, especially for her, as we talked about all these different traumas that she experienced or like could potentially have experienced, and what's going on in this time of war and moving around, and who knows what's going on in the city. I just, she just feels so relatable to me. Rather than this like, I don't know, I guess I described her as this like beautiful mystery, but she feels very relatable today.
Yeah. Today I was thinking in a new way about her. I'm in California, surprise. But thinking about all of the fires and the smoke, and we had the day of darkness last week where the sky just stayed orange and dark all day, and that felt super apocalyptic. And I have a friend from Paradise, California, whose whole town burnt down, and their whole community has this sense of trauma, and that they're all working through years later. And the stories about being stuck in traffic while the fire is on both sides of the road and not getting out, and like those images are coming to play in this text in a way that I didn't expect. And I'm realizing there are a couple different ways that we can interact with the movement going on of her looking back and turning into a pillar of stone. I think, Allison, you can probably agree with this, that I've heard this taught as like almost a magical thing, like because she disobeyed, like God caused this punishment. And like there are other like magical, miraculous things happening in the text, that all the people were struck with blindness by the angels. The angels are doing some magical work here. But like, I'm now wondering if there's more of a natural way to think about that. Like if there was something holding her attention and that she didn't get out quick enough, because that's something that's obvious in the text, like the angels are saying, like, you have to get out now, like they're almost not making it. And so like if there's something that causes her to like take her time, I'm not thinking of her like the moment she turns all of a sudden salt, I'm thinking that like perhaps she was overcome with grief and she was weeping and she had like turned back to weep and was like crying over the city, and like in that time held her back from escaping. I don't think there's enough in here to read this as a divine punishment.
I think especially because we read in the text too, like Lot is the one who's named as the lingerer, not his wife. And I wonder too, so this, what, like, I'm trying to think of, are there ways, I don't want to only read her as like a victim or like someone who's facing like traumatic turmoil, which I think is part of the story.
But it is very tempting to read Lot as an asshole. Can I say that here? I did it. I'll just do it once. I'm tempted to do that. I'm trying to not just do that.
Right. But I'm wondering if there's ways we can empower her too. Like, what if her turning back was a choice to say, these are my people, like I'm staying here. Maybe there's something in her that's calling her back that is, I don't know, like, I don't want to make her seem like masochistic or something like that either, but
if it's grief, that's like, I think we've seen a lot of study about how like grief is powerful and necessary, and like people who are grieving well are like grieving on behalf of a community, and that's a service that they provide, like when people used to hire wailers at a funeral, it was a specific like priestly duty. And my imagination is going there lately, thinking of her like turning around to weep and to bear witness to the destruction rather than just to try to get out and save herself. Lot.
Well, and if like she is this pillar, like she is a marker, like is that a punishment, or is that like there was loss here, she was one of those lost, and now she has the honor, the responsibility, however you want to describe that, she, whether or not, whatever persuaded her to not move forward, now she is maybe a warning for people, but also she is marking that there were people here.
And wow, God came because the city was crying out. People were crying out, and God heard their cry. And how fitting would that be if there was like a statue of a weeping woman to mark that God heard that?
Yeah.
So imaginative, but beautiful.
Yeah. I think we can hold all of these things, which I'm excited about. It's one of my favorite things, to just complicate the narrative, which I know many people in my small group really hate when I do that, but I think it's important. Is there anything else about Lot's wife before we focus more on?
Well, it's not specifically, but kind of.
Go for it.
As I was reading through yesterday, I was just noticing God says, like, there has been an outcry against this town. Like, I've heard a cry. I've heard an outcry. But it never says who is crying out. And that was something that I wondered, like, if the whole town is wicked, who is it that's there to cry out against its wickedness? Like, and I wonder the difference between the men and women in the town. It says all the men are coming to Abraham to Lot to assault the visitors. At one point it says people instead of just men, and that I'm curious about. Like, is that the whole town, or is it just the men? And if it's the men that are abusive, is that something that the women of the town have experienced and know too well? Just speculation, but I wonder who the cry is coming from, and if any of the people that were making that initial cry even got out.
Yeah, that's a hard question, but a good one. It seems to not be Lot. he feels a little surprised by this whole thing, even though he is defensive. But I don't know, perhaps his daughters. I like to think that it's not just the men. I like the people. I don't know why. That part that you mentioned in verse 4. I don't know why I want there to be women there. Like, part of my feminist like self wants
I agree with you.
No, we'll hold ourselves to a higher standard. But I think it's fair to say that, well, for example, like when we talk about original sin, right? Like, a lot of interpretation through history has said, well, it was Eve's fault. And I don't think that we can say like, oh, it was even just like this one action too. I think people talk about, it's like, this is exactly why Sodom had to be destroyed. I don't think that that's true. So I think, picture
I think
women in that space and wondering who the victims are here, what the outcry is about, what is God doing in this text is important.
And I think there's, let me know if I say anything off here, trying to complicate the narrative. But like in systems of violence and oppression, there's very rarely victims who are not touched by that in a way that they would perpetuate it if they had the chance. So like Sarah seems to be a victim of an unhealthy family system, and she perpetuates that by offering Hagar to Abraham. And I think it's easy to get into a mindset of like, who do we blame? Whose fault is it? One person's the oppressor, one person's the victim. But I think it's a lot muckier than that.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair thing to bring into this. I don't want to get off track from like talking about the unnamed women because there's just so much here that we could talk about. But
you're good.
Yeah, so let's leave that there. Maybe we'll bring it back around in the end. But
that was the unnamed women of the town we were wondering about.
Absolutely. That counts. It was more my next thought, I think.
Okay.
So we're gonna jump back in and read a little bit more. So we ended in verse 26, but we're actually gonna skip over a couple of verses because they're just about Abraham and he's not who we're here for. So I'm going to start in verse 30 and read through verse 38. Now Lot went up to Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. On the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Look, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Ben-Ami, Hebrew for son of my father.
Good name, classic. So the daughters are mentioned here. They have a more active role, I guess you could say, in this part. But I also want to remind us they're mentioned, the angels mention them, and they are mentioned by their father when the town people are at the door.
Yeah, they are.
Type of offering. So Yeah, where do we want to start? With the daughters. What stood out to you today, Austin?
I think for me, it's been interesting to think about the daughters and the wife and what they have in common. Going a little bit more abstractly, I think that most of the context of Genesis is this promise that God makes to Abraham for a future, and because of God's relationship with Abraham, God decides to save Lot as well. But it seems like this promise of a future is ambiguous as to who it includes. Does it include Lot's wife and Lot's daughters? And that traditional reading saying like she wasn't obedient, she like could have been saved if she was obedient. I don't know if the promise was made to her, and I don't know if the promise was made to Lot's daughters. And I think this ambiguity of a future, of a prosperous future, is something that all of their actions are related to. And thinking of the dichotomy between past and future, and where Lot's wife is looking, if she can't imagine a different future, perhaps that's why she's stuck in the past. And that makes me think of like post-traumatic stress disorder, or just post-traumatic stress, and getting caught up in the events of the past because the future is not imaginable to you or graspable. And if I'm comparing Lot's wife and Lot's daughters in that way, I would say Lot's wife was frozen in that grief of the past, and Lot's daughters took action to bring something about on their own when they couldn't see anything else coming for them.
Yeah, I think when I read, especially this second part, I often have to like take a moment and remove the like shock to like, what are they doing? Because so the title in my text shames them. It says the shameful origin of Moab and Ammon. But I don't think the text actually shames them. That title is something that is added afterward. It's not in the original text. I don't think that shame is inherent in the text. I do think that we're supposed to understand them feeling empowered and taking action to preserve their futures, the way they talk it, preserve children. And something that's notable in the previous part that Austin read is there were sons-in-law. Lot goes to his sons-in-law and says, hey, we got to get out of here. And they thought he was joking. And so for the daughters, they left behind their home. They lost their mother. They lost their hope for a future with these, sons-in-law. And now like their father is making them live in a cave because he doesn't trust that he's going to be safe because of his own traumas. And so here, this really does feel like an act of resiliency to me, and not one of shame at all, even though it feels weird to say that. I wonder, I don't know, are there things about the daughters or about the wife that, I don't know, relate to our current context? I guess you talked a little bit about that for you, but maybe the daughters too in hoping. Are there, I guess I'm asking myself the question, are there things that I have control over that I can do to help me be resilient, to move toward the future, to work within my context, that are going to be empowering? Is this only empowering, or is this also harmful to them? I don't know.
I think spending time lingering in the story and with the context. It's a helpful practice in compassion and compassionate listening to the story and to trying to understand them, the daughters, rather than just saying, that's a shameful act. How absurd. But to take the time to get to know where they're at, to try to imagine the trauma of the situation. I think one of the texts says, or one of the verses says they thought the world had ended. They thought there was no one left on earth after what they'd seen.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I don't think that's a trauma that we could imagine. And I think they're in a situation where like the rules go out the window. And I think it's a very extreme example of being in relationship with people that have stories that come across in one way before you really get to know them and get to know the story, and reserving judgment. And I think it's beautiful to read them as resilient.
Something I just thought of too, what you were saying is, I feel like in my brain I was thinking of like self-preservation and like, oh, we have lost these things. They are our community, but I was reading it as selfish. But if their perspective is like the world has ended, or at least this region of the world has ended, then their hope for the future is even bigger. It's not just for their own futures, but their desire to have kids is way bigger than that. And I think that's a part of the text that I feel like is not shaming them, is that it talks about these kids that they have go on to become nations. So there's,
and that when we're talking about Abraham being promised to be the father of a nation, and his story keeps getting complicated by not happening, and in the middle of his story not becoming nations, you have Lot's daughters taking it upon themselves to create nations.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
I don't know, that just is so much more hopeful than I think I originally read this story, even when we started today.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I'm glad for that.
Me too. I'm thinking about like there's a way to tell the story that leaves them out as agents. There's a way to tell the story that just says like the Moabites and Ammonites came from an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, we would read it in a much different way. But it doesn't. It even has a conversation between them. And I think that's pretty profound. But in a Hebrew text, is that still supposed to be a dig at like these nations for like they're unholy nations because of this origin? But it still gives the daughters agency. So
I guess it depends on who you label as the good guys and bad guys. It's all about perspective. So maybe that's what the author intended, but we can reclaim it, I think. So
the bad guys and good girls. Just kidding.
Well, so let's close. What do we I don't know. What are we taking away from this text? What do we feel like God has revealed to us today? Or what are the questions we're taking with us as we go forward? Do you have something that's coming to mind for you?
Yeah, I do. Broadly, and I think a lesson that we'll return to, talking about unnamed women. I'm convicted of the need to be more curious in my life when when I hear people telling stories and I want to make judgments, to be more curious about the people that don't get to speak, and to seek out those stories when they're available to me. And I think that's a really good goal.
I think for me, there's lots of things going on in my head, but I think a little bit of it has to do with perspective. And practicing perspective myself, in that, like, when I approach different people, different stories, even things in my own life, how can I not just assume society's interpretation of those things upon myself, but claim them, own them, pray about them, and explore how they can be redeemed, or the way God is being glorified through those things, such as being a pillar of salt, or, taking action to preserve a future, even when you're feeling super low, I think, are things that can be reclaimed. And so I guess I'm feeling called to pay attention to what other things I come in contact with that can be reclaimed, to just share God's mercy and love and peace in this world that desperately needs it.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much, Austin, for doing this with me. This is a weird time for all of us, and I think it's nice to, get to focus on even the hard stories in the text, because it shows that humans have made it through a lot, and God is with them through that. So we ask you, viewers, that you reflect on what you learned from the story. What is God revealing to you? Is it similar to the things we shared? Did you notice things we didn't? We hope that you will talk about them with your family, your friends, think about them as you go on walks, whatever it is.
Yeah, let them linger.
Yeah. And we'll be back next week, so we hope that you'll join us for that as we talk about another unnamed woman. Goodbye, all. Bye, Austin. Peace be with you.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Allison, you're the best. Everyone's lucky that you have her.
Bye.